Bond. James Bond.
Competition is a necessary headache that we have to deal with, and it's not always a bad thing because growth and change can come from conflict, but in the cinema, that can sometimes backfire. For example, in 1997, 2 films about volcanoes were released as part of the CGI-enhanced disaster craze, and while both had their merits, one ended up more critically liked while the other had the bigger box office, and yet both have faded into relative obscurity. In the crowded world of today's cinema, where we often see gargantuan franchises turn out various entries in quick succession, this can lead to oversaturation in the marketplace that will ultimately hurt all involved. But even with today's climate, very rarely will we see multiple films featuring the same lead character released in the same year as competitors from different companies. I've heard many people claim that 1983 was the first time that we saw 2 James Bond pictures at the box office. Not only is that not true, as 1967 saw both Charlie Feldman's Casino Royale and the Eon-produced You Only Live Twice, but depending on where you live, 1964 had 2 Bond pictures have their theatrical releases. But 1983 was unique in that the 2 pictures were from rivaling companies and were attempts at being straight Bond pictures. I'd hesitate to call Octopussy a serious film without some sort of qualifier. The legendary Sean Connery was back as 007, a role that he famously had mixed feelings about, and the film, Never Say Never Again, was being produced by Kevin McClory, who also produced Thunderball, and directed by Irvin Kershner, who had just wrapped up his work on The Empire Strikes Back, the smash hit sequel to the original Star Wars. During this time of turmoil, Roger Moore was seriously thinking about departing from the role after being lured back in for For Your Eyes Only. So Eon was on the prowl for a new James Bond, and the man who was closest to getting the part was James Brolin, who actually shot some screen tests, had a wardrobe fitting, and moved to England for filming. But at the 11th hour, they managed to sign Roger for his 6th film, thinking that an established Bond was the only way they might compete with Connery's film. And it's hard to argue that this idea doesn't make some kind of sense. The marketing strategies for both are also really interesting. Never Say Never Again leaned into the return of its star like it was on the same level as a Beatles reunion, while Octopussy made its series heritage the selling point. Yeah, the other film has Connery, but ours is from the people who made all of the other official ones you love, and it has every element you'd want from a Bond film. In the end, both did very well at the box office. Never Say Never Again made the bigger splash on its opening weekend, while Octopussy had the bigger revenue overall by the end of its run. But money isn't everything, and so the question is posed. How could Roger Moore possibly fare against the legendary Connery at playing the same game? 2 knife-wielding killers chase down a man dressed as a clown late at night in Germany. The clown is 009, and he is in possession of a Fabergé egg. He is killed by the duo, but not before delivering the egg to the English ambassador. The egg is discovered to be a fake, and the real one is set to be auctioned off. James Bond heads to the auction and decides to follow the buyer, Kamal Khan, back to his home in India. Once there, he discovers that Kamal is in league with both the Russian General Orlov and a mysterious smuggler and cult leader named Octopussy. Bond must dodge a legion of killers while also uncovering what Kamal has planned with the egg that involves a general bent on Russian dominance and a smuggling ring that uses various legitimate businesses like a circus for cover. Octopussy is a rather curious entry for me. After For Your Eyes Only made a statement about grounding Bond, this one turns back to The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker territory. Based on box office numbers, Eyes did well, so I have to wonder if this shift was either because audience reception to that film was mixed, or because Connery was known for doing the more grounded, serious type of films, and so they felt as though they should lean into what Moore excels at. In any event, Octopussy is a clear attempt at bombastic fun with lots of comedy thrown in. This is a very tricky thing to get right, because you can either end up with the most fantastic, escapist entertainment, or an inane drag. The film lands closer to the former for me, but it swan dives into the latter occasionally as well. Yet among the more notorious things like the Tarzan yell, British agents dressing up as clowns, and the fun with the animals, at the core of this film is an espionage thriller akin to Eyes. It's steeped in the politics at the time, though it continues to follow Cubby's mantra of not villainizing the Russians as a whole. And there's a lot of dangerous scenarios and shifty characters throughout. Thus, you might be caught off guard with how one minute you have Bond zooming in on some cleavage with a camera, and then the next you have a guy with a yo-yo buzzsaw. John Glenn repeatedly stated that he wanted to make his Bond films a reflection of the older Connery films, where gadgets were less prevalent and Bond's ingenuity was emphasized. Yet this determination to have that groundedness is often at odds with the comedic bits which signal that the film is going for something more flamboyant. Those earlier films certainly had comedy, sure, but they were never so outlandish so as to call attention to themselves and often just felt like in-character moments. A lot of the lighter material here feels artificially inserted in order to appease certain mandates, and thus the jarring tone shifts that many have criticized in a lot of Glenn's Bond films. If you are willing to accept this as part of the piece, then these films will provide massive amounts of entertainment. If you are striving for a certain verisimilitude with Bond, then I imagine Moore's last films are amongst your least favorites. It all comes down to a simple question. How much brainpower and logical story progression are you willing to give up so that you can be entertained for a few hours? Bond films, along with most action films, have always required this as part of the admission price, and some just take it further than others. I don't bring up this point to condemn spectacle films. There are plenty that provide cranium-stimulating depth with fantastic action, but instead to suggest that they often play by different rules. Much as I should not go into a Godzilla film trying to view it as I would an Ingmar Bergman film, I should not go into classic Bond expecting it to be 3 Days of the Condor or The Spy Who Came In from the Cold. If it seems like I'm being all over the place with how I land on this film, that is accurate. Octopussy commits some of the incriminating mistakes that drag down films like A View to a Kill for me, and so I should disregard the film just on principle. Yet a lot of it entertains me in the same way that The Spy Who Loved Me does. It's a clownish charlatan, much like Bond at the circus, pretending to be a more grounded Cold War thriller when it's really more like a dime novel, going for superficial thrills rather than long-lasting depth. Despite my preferences in Bond films, I'd be lying if I said that the movie doesn't mostly win me over to its side. There are two big influences on the story. The first is Ian Fleming, and the other is Goldfinger. The first may seem like a silly thing to claim, but hear me out. There's a lot more here than you might think. Obviously, the auction scene is taken right out of the short story Property of a Lady, including that line, actually, and Octopussy's father and his background are taken from the titular tale, but there's a few more that I noticed. The backgammon scene is very similar to a scene in the Moonraker novel where Sir Hugo Drax cheats at cards and Bond figures out his trick rather quickly. Khan's final line of "Spend the money quickly, Mr. Bond," is almost verbatim what Drax says. The scene with 009 and the twins shares elements of both The Living Daylights and From A View to a Kill. And the scene in which Bond is disguised as a clown and the audience thinks that's who he is and that he's part of the act is remarkably similar to an unused Fleming scenario where the Russian killer is disguised as a clown and the audience think that the fight is part of the act. As for Goldfinger, the comparisons often speak for themselves. Both plots deal with smuggling valuable materials and exploding a nuclear bomb at a military installation. Both feature a leading lady who runs a group of talented young women that Bond wins over to his side. Both feature a pre-credits scene in a Latin American country. Both feature a villain cheating at a game and Bond distracts him by pulling out something valuable that he clearly wants. Both have henchmen with unique headwear demonstrating their physical strength by crushing some item that was key to said game, and both have their climax in a personal plane with someone falling to their death. Yet, despite these similarities, I wouldn't label Octopussy a remake of Goldfinger. but instead as a student learning from its more accomplished mentor. And weirdly, this makes symmetrical sense, as For Your Eyes Only was patterned a lot after From Russia with Love. Roger Moore certainly feels more in his element with this one than Eyes, and while that film churned out a more understated and somber performance, this one is far more familiar. He never takes himself too seriously, and so he avoids the pitfalls that we might have seen with a newcomer. He's a safe bet when it comes to Bond, but you do get a feeling after watching Eyes that perhaps he should veer out of his comfort territory more often because he really delivered there. Yet I can't blame him for knowing his own boundaries, and it rarely interferes with my enjoyment of his films, and there's usually a fantastic moment with his acting in just about every film. Here, it's the scene with Bond and Orlov on the train car. His realization at the horrific aftermath of the scheme, while the general is practically grinning with prideful delight, is so sick and awesome to watch. There's something that feels authentic about that scene, making it my acting highlight of the whole film. However, Moore has great bits throughout, most notably in the love scene with Octopussy where he refuses her offer to go into business with her. Moore keeps in mind that Bond's purpose is always to the mission and duty first, and that's one of the character traits I love about 007. It's inspiring to watch a man so principled like that he can refuse the temptations that I might succumb to. To summarize, Moore's take is starting to feel a little long in the tooth, but I can't deny that it's a fun take to watch from time to time. Maud Adams knocks it out of the park with Octopussy for me. Whereas I felt like Andrea Anders was a little out of place in Golden Gun, Octopussy makes for one of the most mysterious and intriguing Bond women. It's the first time in a while that the age difference doesn't feel so obvious, and I'm convinced that a large reason for that is because Adams is selling us on this woman being as skilled and intelligent as Bond, but not in the same areas. She's an accomplished smuggler and businesswoman, devoting herself to helping her cult of women in a misguided but noble-sounding way, and she has a lot of respect for Bond. The personal connection with her father was a great move, and thus it makes it easy to see her as the one woman during Moore's run that I could actually see a future with and that has a deeper connection with Bond. I'm not suggesting they settle down or anything, but that I could see them keeping in touch and trying a relationship of some kind after the film is over. They really are two of a kind, and thus Octopussy ranks as my favorite leading lady of Moore's 7 films. This is the first film in a while that successfully uses two main villains for its story. Louis Jourdan's Kamal Khan is a mix of slyness and charm. Much like Hugo Drax, he has some great lines, and he doesn't seem to underestimate the threat that Bond could pose to his plans. He also has a duplicitous streak that's a lot of fun. He's willing to double-cross anyone if it serves him personally. He might not be at the top of the pack for villains in this series, but he's a worthy addition. Steven Berkoff's General Orlov is ridiculously campy and overacted. But I've seen Berkoff in a few things, and knowing his theater chops, this is the kind of thing that he brings to his performances, and it's entertaining if you're willing to just go with it. He still manages to be a credible threat, and I know there will be at least one acting choice or delivery in every one of his scenes that I'll adore. I understand if he breaks the reality of the film for you, but everyone has their guilty pleasures, and Berkoff's performance is one of mine. I always found Gubinda to be one of the best henchmen in the series. Sure, he's very much a template henchman that you might expect, but maybe it's because he doesn't indulge in the broader comedy, and he's so physical and gets down and dirty that my eyes are drawn to him. There's something that's genuinely scary about this guy, and thus he's a real menace. On a side note, I do love the moment when he hesitates before going out of the plane to fight Bond. It gets a chuckle from me every time. Magda seems to be an attempt at a femme fatale. I like her when she's around. I especially love the moment when she exits the hotel room, but I can't say that she's a favorite of mine, as once Octopussy is introduced, Magda fades into the background. She's a character that works well enough, and ultimately that might be the point, but I'm hard-pressed to say that she's a standout in her field. Vijay is one of the more likable Bond allies, and I wish the union dispute behind the scenes didn't force the filmmakers to split his role with Sadruddin, played by returning Albert Moses, and who I have really nothing to say about. Every time I watch this film, I keep thinking he's in more of it, but he's actually only in a few scenes. Armitage makes the most of his time, and his presence is missed when he exits the film. Robert Brown makes for a fairly standard M in his debut as the character, but to be fair, it's clear they wanted another Bernard Lee type for the role, as there was nothing wrong with that. And Brown does a fine job, and I enjoy having a proper M back in the films after the unimpressive James Villiers Tanner performance from the last film. By the way, I like to think that Admiral Hargreaves and Brown's M are the same man, as it's a harmless fan theory that the films never offer much opposition to. This is also the best use of Q so far in the series, and Desmond Llewellyn looks to be having a great time here. Lastly, I wanted to give a shout out to the knife-throwing twins, Mishka and Grishka. Ever since doing the henchman ranking video, I keep running across people that I left off of that list, and while I'll stand by most of the omissions, I'm kicking myself a little for not putting these two on there. They wouldn't have been too high, but I feel like they're pretty efficient killers, and much like Gubinda, I'm not laughing at them at any point when they bring out their knives. I think in another film, the idea of killer twins could have been expanded on more, and under the right circumstances, we might have had another Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd situation on our hands. John Glenn once again proves himself as a fine director, excelling in his action scenes for the most part, while developing his craft on doing the dialogue-heavy scenes. For these lower-budget adventures where Bond eschews using gadgets as get-out-of-jail-free cards, Glenn is pretty adept at what makes them work. However, I'm really not a fan of the safari scene. It's a neat idea, but I think the execution is pretty bad. Beyond the jokes, I feel little tension here, and it's not because I know Bond will be fine. It's because of the animals. Each of these bits have no real payoff once they are introduced for Bond to deal with. For example, a crocodile is seen coming after Bond in one moment, but there's no follow-through with that. Bond doesn't seem to have to deal with the croc, and it doesn't slow him down. Same idea for the snake going across his legs. Also, it feels pretty strange to have so many dangerous animals for Bond to come across, and we never see the pursuing party come across them as well. So they feel artificially inserted just for Bond to have obstacles, and thus the scenes are starting to come apart, and I feel like there's writer manipulation of the action rather than the animals being natural hurdles to come across during the scene. It's easily my least favorite section of the film. But I don't want to dog on the film too much for its action, as we have some really great set pieces here. The Acrostar microjet in the beginning is a fantastic way for the film to open. There's a solid fight in Octopussy's quarters, and I'm especially fond of some of the choreography here. And there's a noteworthy moment before the fight begins where Bond is looking out a window and one of the henchmen is on the balcony behind him in the background. There's a glorious train fight that feels inspired by the truck chase in Raiders of the Lost Ark, and while it's not quite on that level, it's one of my favorite Bond action scenes. The finale on the top of the plane features some great work from the aerial stunt crew. Seriously, can we get B.J. Worth and his men an honorary Oscar for all their work on this series? I even like the taxicab sequence in the middle where Bond has to leave for a bit in order to have some fun with the street performers. It is pretty silly, but I like that the scene continues Glenn's mantra of Bond not relying on gadgets to solve all of his problems, and thus he has to use his environment to get out of the situation. But above all, I commend the filmmakers for their handling of Bond dressing up as a clown to find the bomb. I know this is a bridge too far for some. Circuses and Bond don't seem to mix too well, despite their cropping up in several entries. But I think the scenario works beautifully, and I feel the rising tension throughout. It's actually one of my favorite suspense moments in all of Bond. Peter Lamont's sets are hit and miss for me. I love the way the Russian briefing scene looks at the beginning. It has a real Ken Adam feel to it, and I love the interior of both palaces. However, is it as obvious to anyone else that the exterior final fight outside the Monsoon Palace is shot on a set? John Barry comes back for his 9th Bond score, and I feel like he finally addresses some of the criticisms I had with his scores since Diamonds. He both crafts a soundtrack that works well within the film, which is a problem I expressed with Moonraker, and he integrates more interesting original material than usual. It's speculated that the reason that there is so much Bond theme in this one is that it was a deliberate choice by the filmmakers to compete with the Bond theme-less Never Say Never Again. But whatever the reason, I love that Barry went with it. It's a favorite of mine. I'm not as big of a fan on the title song, though. I love its instrumental versions throughout, and Tim Rice gives us some great lyrics, but something about Rita Coolidge's vocal version feels mundane and meh to me. I also love a lot of the costume work for this one. Each character feels distinct and the clothes look great. I already mentioned Magda's dress and how it's used for one scene. Octopussy has a really great dress for the finale, but I also love some of Roger Moore's outfits here. Having both his black and his white suits in the same film is a great idea, and I love the safari outfit he has. Gubinda has a collection of turbans here, and they're beautifully woven and tied together. I usually make a running game throughout involving the turbans he wears. Some of the finer points of the story are quite sloppy, particularly the handling of the Fabergé egg. I share Calvin Dyson's confusion on where the second egg goes once the real thing is discovered, and I can't believe Orloff just smashes the real one. But I also have to wonder, how did the real egg get out in the open in order to be auctioned off? We know that 009 is responsible for the fake one getting out, but I would assume that Khan and Orloff would have kept close tabs on the real egg, if not outright kept them themselves as a contingency plan, much like they do with the Romanov star. I also feel like that certain moments of Bond getting out of danger are pretty flimsy. I don't know about you, but I feel like this knife goes in farther than it should. How does Bond get out of this gorilla suit without Gubinda seeing him? Did the fake crocodile gadget that Bond drives kill the henchman in the water? Or was that a real crocodile that just happened to come along and kill the guy and Bond fakes his death and escapes? For many, Octopussy is the beginning of the end for Roger Moore as Bond. It tries to half and half it between Moonraker and Eyes, and that results in a mixed bag. The shifting tone is not always natural, and there's a lot of overfamiliarity to the piece during much of the runtime. The best way I can describe this film is trying to make a magnificent dinner out of leftovers. It's fairly obvious what pieces the film is using from the past, and there's a fair amount of fancy presentation to it. Yet, like Leftovers, a lot of those pieces are from things I loved before, and I have no qualms about eating them again. Sometimes the combination can leave a bad taste, but at other times, I'm really enjoying this time I spend with it, and there's more than a fair few things to really admire. I miss some of the improvements that I felt Eyes was striving to incorporate, and when I put on my analytical hat, Octopussy is one of the more run-of-the-mill and disappointing Bond films. But if I'm just looking for Roger charming women, doing covert spy work, high-flying action scenes, and villains with great lines, Octopussy hits all of those marks really well, and thus it delivers what it promises. So obviously 1983 didn't spell doom for the franchise, but despite my more favorable impressions of the film, it has grown to have more of a negative reputation and be a bit of a punchline for people. If you compare this to some of the earlier films like Russia and Goldfinger, it's strange to think that they're part of the same franchise. Despite the mixed reactions to the film, this style mostly continued on into the next official entry, which would be Roger Moore's final curtain call. But before we move on to A View to a Kill, we should first examine the rival Bond of 1983 and see if time has been kind to this outlying anomaly.